The idea that these creatures can make themselves appear something differently than they are. They can shapeshift and they can appear differently. My name is Ron Murphy, and I'm located, and I do a lot of my research in Western Pennsylvania in the foothills of the Chestnut Ridge. And the Chestnut Ridge is really what got me started in this kind of inquiry into the unknown. I was a child of the 1970s, and I grew up in a very small Western Pennsylvania town that had very little to offer. It had two streetlights, and not much else was going on there. But what was going on is that Bigfoot was being sighted on the outskirts of my town back in 1977. My mother and we would listen to Stan Gordon, who was a local Bigfoot investigator, and he would talk about one time a month on a radio station out of Pittsburgh about all the sightings that were happening. And my mother would figure out where the sightings were taking place, and then she would take me in the vehicle, and we would go do our own little investigation of these sites. So it was a great time to be alive. It was a great bonding experience with my mother. This was also a time whenever Leonard Nimoy's In Search of was on, and shows like That's Incredible and The Legend of Boggy Creek was coming out. So as a kid, this was great. And to take all this kind of enthusiasm about the unknown and the paranormal, I would go to the library and actually looking up real books and tracking them down. It was just a great time. And that's really what kind of parlayed this into what I do now. I had that kind of exuberance in my youth for the unexplained, and I've always had my mother's constant backing about this kind of stuff. And I look at the world with really kind of wide-eyed wonder. And I know there's more things out there than just meets the eye. But whenever I went to college, this is not the place to talk about cryptids and the paranormal and the supernatural. But I was taking an anthropology class, and in one of the books, it was discussing human myths. And one of the things that was brought up in that particular chapter was the idea of these hairy wild men, of these unexplained creatures that look very similar to Bigfoot, and the abominable snowman and such. And the professor that wrote the book in the book suggested that it's possible that the reason why we have these wild man myths is that the hominid known as Gigantopithecus may have existed up into historic times, and that gave precedent for these archetypes. Now, that was a game changer for me, because now this was a real college textbook. This was written by, a doctor of anthropology, and his suggestion was to not really discount all these kind of myths and legends out there and look for some sort of explanation for these things. And that's really kind of colored what I do now. I try to look at my investigations through a lens of multidisciplinary aspects, sociology, psychology, anthropology, because without looking at all these myriad of ways, you're never going to get a focused picture of what we're going after right now. So as a researcher and as a writer and as an investigator, I try to find out the reason why these archetypes exist, and then kind of figure out if these archetypes are indeed based upon any kind of reality within the natural world.
Well, with all of the research and investigations that you've done over the years, what have you concluded with that? What are some of the aha moments that you've had?
Well, I think one of the aha moments that I've had is that creatures that we think of as Bigfoot and even like werewolves and vampires, these are cross-cultural. This is part of our humanity, and as I said, these things are embroidered into our DNA. And in order for their survival and order for our survival, we need them as much as they need us. And there's a reasoning for this, and that is what I'm trying to get at the root of. It is my feeling that as an investigator, that in our distant shared humanity, in our distant past, we indeed encountered creatures that would become, through myths and legends, the vampires and the werewolves that we have today. Now, that doesn't mean that we were dealing with, what you would perceive as a vampire or a werewolf or a Bigfoot, but at least though there was a genesis of that in our ancient past that we carry with us in a collective unconscious with us to this very day. It's a part of our folk memory. Now, that's okay from an anthropological point of view, but then from a cryptid investigator's point of view, what we try to figure out now is, are these creatures biologically in existence to this very day? And what I'm finding out as an investigator, I think creatures like Bigfoot, if they are not still present within our world, at least were up until a relatively recent period of time. We have these discoveries. We always pull out the idea of the coelacanth, this kind of fossil fish that exists off the coast of Madagascar that was recently rediscovered. These are tantalizing creatures that provide us with at least the hope that certain creatures that have existed in the past can continue to exist with us nowadays. In the fossil record, in the archaeological record, we do have things out there that have really kind of disturbed us as a species. When I've been in education for most of my adult life, and I know that whenever we deal with the idea of childhood development and childhood education, there's this idea that children are often confronted with some sort of obstacle in their life, and how they overcome that obstacle will guide them for the rest of their lives. And I think that we as a human race have encountered certain obstacles that were monstrous to us, and we did not deal with these things very well. And those obstacles that we encountered that we were not able to overcome have now become the monsters that are haunting our collective closets.
So do you believe that Bigfoot is a real flesh and blood creature? Do you believe it's something that's generated from the minds of the people experiencing it?
Yes, these are excellent questions, and I think that there is a couple ways to look at this. I know that when we look at the idea of Bigfoot around the world, with the woodwose in England, and the abominable snowman in the Himalayas, and the Mapinguari down in South America, and the Yeren in China, and the Almasy in Russia. All around the world, we have these ideas. The Yowie in Australia, we have the idea of these wild men creatures, right? But one of the things that we often overlook is the idea that these ancient cultures all had a notion that these creatures were not completely physical. There was a spirituality to them. So they straddled the line between the real and the supernatural, between the mundane and the miraculous. They were kind of like a conduit between two worlds. So nowadays we're out in the woods looking for footprints and we're banging on trees. But I think that that's the wrong approach, because if we are going to indeed get to the root of what we're searching for, we have to start looking at these titles of Bigfoot and such from a way that they were perceived in our past, that these are also spiritual creatures. I don't think that they're tulpas. I don't think they are created from our collective mindset and somehow projected into the world. But I think that what we talk about is something more than just a lumbering ape-like creature in the woods. I think there's another element to this, another dimension to this, if you will, that we have overlooked. And not only have we overlooked it, but I think that we're a bit tentative and maybe even a little bit scared to approach these things from a spiritual aspect, because once we do that, we are dealing with something that we really can't comprehend. We're dealing with something that's theoretical, and we're dealing with something that is outside of the bounds of science. And a lot of researchers don't like that idea. A lot of researchers want to use a scientific method. And I think that's the best way to start. But whenever we look at something that's been going on for a couple of hundred years here in the United States, and for thousands of years in Europe, and people have talked about these creatures and tried to to explain them away, and it's not working, yet we're not finding any kind of solid evidence. We're not finding any kind of bodies. We don't have any real photographs taken of these things besides the Patterson-Gimlin film. When all of that kind of ancillary evidence does not exist, then we must, it's a necessary must, we have to look outside the bounds of these creatures being purely physical and look at a metaphysical explanation for these things.
Well, and I'm sure you have the same and much more probably experience than I do, but in all of the interviews that I have, I have two camps. I have those people have had experiences or believe that they're just a flesh and blood creature, a creature that just hasn't been discovered yet, which could be. And then we have the other people that are having some really unusual paranormal things. And a lot of it mimics the behavior of UFOs. It mimics the behavior of ghosts. It mimics the behavior of a lot of just paranormal experiences that I know people have had. Can you address some of that?
Oh, absolutely. And that is the thing. So there's a gray area. And I've been researching now for about 30 years, and I've worked with both sides of the fence regarding what people think these things are. And I do know that there's a lot of investigators out there that already have a preconceived notion of what they're dealing with. This is some sort of relic hominid that's still existing, and it's definitely a flesh and blood creature. And if they gather any evidence from eyewitnesses that suggests otherwise, they throw it out. Okay, that is happening a lot. And I know that sometimes whenever Bigfoot is seen in conjunction with UFOs, a lot of people don't pay any attention to this either because it doesn't make any sense. So as an investigator, seeing places where Bigfoot sightings have taken place, as well as UFO sightings, and places that are also deemed to be haunted, I'm left with a lot more questions than whenever I started. It is my opinion, and this might be a relatively unpopular opinion, but it is my opinion that Bigfoot and dogmen and ghosts to some extent, and even UFOs do not exist as wholly separate manifestations. I believe that what we're dealing with here is an earth energy with an intelligence that's able to project itself into our world. And we who perceive these kind of manifestations fill in the blanks and make them into what we want them to be. So I do a lot of research into the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance. That is where I was trained at in college. I'm a medievalist. So whenever I look at accounts from the Middle Ages, you always have these accounts that have a spirituality attached to them or a metaphysical connotation to them. And at the end of the day, what I'm left with whenever I read reports from the Renaissance that appear to be, alien abduction stories, or whenever I read things from the Middle Ages that deal with ghosts or other types of beasties, the overall connection here is the idea of the world of the Fae. And a lot of people don't like to talk about this kind of stuff because when we talk about fairies, we talk about the idea that is in our mind about the Victorian conception of them, a winged Marilyn Monroe figure. But that's indeed not what they were. They were part of the world around them. Paracelsus, the great, alchemist from the Renaissance, saw them as part of the elements themselves. They were the intelligences within the elements. And I think that that's the way I'm going. And I know that that's, like I said, this is not a very common type of explanation. But at the end of the day, I don't know what else we're left with. People are out there with cameras, people are out there with cell phones, people are out there seeing these things, but they're never captured. Yet whenever I interview these people, I know that they're not lying. You know, these are so sober, intelligent human beings who've had some sort of experience with an unknown creature. So what I'm left with is this, that these creatures are not, you know, you don't have the 12-foot tall Bigfoot out there in physical form. But what we do have out there is an earth energy with an intelligence that's able to assume different manifestations, but they're within your mind. Now, if we look at the Middle Ages, you know, we have a term for that, and a term that has come to us to this very day, and that is the idea of glamour, right? The idea that these creatures, these intelligences, can make themselves appear something differently than they are, and that's where our word glamour comes from today, about makeup, that they can shape shift and they can appear differently. And I think that that is what we are dealing with, and that is why it's so difficult to pin these things down in a scientific way, because fairies don't like to be, you know, prodded with scientific instruments and put on a table and put under a magnifying glass. I think we're dealing with something that maybe is not scientifically quantitative.
Well, I understand exactly what you're talking about. It's very difficult to assess from everything that we have. I think, you know, what it boils down to, or what I hear you saying really, is that, you know, our reality is really transferred into what we think we're seeing in our own brains, our own mind, you know, and so we first need to understand how perception occurs, or any of these the things that we base reality on to start with, before we can understand when something is real or not real.
Yep, very eloquently stated. And you know, Rene Descartes had this idea of the Cartesian theory of the mind, and basically, you know, we are the directors of the film that plays within our mind. You know, our brain is kind of like this canvas, and if we're fed a little bit of information, we take that little bit of information and we kind of make our own little film about it, right? So it is really about perception, about, and you know, when we talk about ghosts, you know, a lot of people go into haunted locations and it's very subjective. Some people have experiences, some people don't. But really, at the end of the day, it is about the one person, the experiencer, the eyewitness that has had this particular event happen to them. And then in turn, that experiencer is now trying to explain what happened to them to us. But it's a very personal, very intimate type of thing. And it might be impossible completely to explain away what somebody had seen, or, you know, to get the point across, because it is that personal. But yeah, I mean, it really has so much to do with the inner workings of the human mind.
It does, and I think that's the gap that is not filled in here at all. We probably give a lot of liberty to things like ghost, or, you know, an apparition that we might see of a past loved one. I mean, we know that they're not there, they're not physical. It's just something that appears to us, and it's there and it's gone or something. But we don't have that same concept of this creature that's this physical, like in the woods. Therefore, it's there's this gap that really doesn't fit with the cryptid world.
That's right. That's right. And that's the reason why I keep on going back to the idea of the fairy. So if we look at certain accounts, like one of the most famous encounters was by a person by the name of Robert Kirk in Scotland. And whenever you read his encounter, it almost reads as an alien abduction, right? He goes out for a walk in the woods. He sees a hill. The side of the hill lights up as if a door opens at the side of the hill. And he looks in and he sees figures that he can't quite explain within the hill. And later on, he is taken into that world. And, you know, so this is, if this happened in 2023, this is an abduction scenario. But whenever it happened back in the Renaissance, the person that was experiencing it felt it as if it was a fairy encounter. And at the end of the day, Robert Kirk, by some accounts, by legend, he disappears and is never seen again. He enters that world and never comes back. Okay, that's just one thing. And we speed up a little bit more in time and we go back into the early 1900s. And C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, stated that he stayed in a house that was haunted by ghosts and also infested by fairies. And he said the fairies were the worst. They were worse than the ghosts. And again, go back into the Middle Ages. We talk about, wood knocking. That was a sign, not that Bigfoot was in those woods, but it was a sign that fairies were in there. So we all are going to coat and paint our reality by the particular culture and by our particular backgrounds. And because we live in a scientific culture, and because we live in a world that's vastly different than that, we are now going to project different elements onto these experiences. And I think a lot of the times, whenever people are experiencing these things that we can't explain, something happening in the woods, we automatically assume that it is extraterrestrial because it is so foreign to us. And there's films out there, and we know that if we're in the woods and we're experiencing lights and we're experiencing things that we cannot explain, it has to be aliens because we're conditioned for that. But if you read Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, whenever he claims that he was abducted, he said, of course, this happens in the woods, right? It doesn't happen out anyplace else. It always happens in the natural world. And he spoke about in the book about the aliens that abducted him. They smelled like cinnamon, and the spacecraft smelled very woodsy, as if it was in the natural world. And that is what we're getting at here. Is I think that what we're dealing with is something that's been with us since the very beginning of humanity. And now, as we are able to proliferate our experiences on places like the television and on the internet and everything, these experiences are getting out there more and more. But we are projecting our own culture onto them. And if we would look at them at face value, these are things that have been happening with us from the very beginning. But we're color coding them now to match our environment.
And that's a very complex thought. And I can see that, most people don't have what I would call, the background that you have in the subject matter. My background is purely intuitive, just to understand how we become more aware of that world, how we become more aware of ourselves and our inner world. So I can understand from your point of view, but how do you take someone who's just out there in the woods, they have this, what they feel like is just a real genuine physical flesh and blood experience, and connect those dots for them?
Right. So that's a difficult thing. And a lot of times whenever I'm on a conference, it's almost as if you are in a confessional, right? Because somebody will come up to you and say, do you really believe in this stuff? And then I would say, I keep an open mind because I've never experienced, the Bigfoot or anything like that. And then they would walk away from my table and they would come back a little bit later. And sometimes they would have tears in their eyes and they would say, well, I have something to tell you, because they really have to get this off of their chest. And I believe in them. I believe that the majority of the people that say that they've had an experience did have an experience, because they're getting nothing out of life lying about something that would ostracize them around most people, right? So something had happened to them. So it's really not my job to say, hey, you saw a fairy, but it's my job to really kind of sit there and listen to what they have to say. But a lot of times whenever I hear somebody, they interject a notion of the miraculous into it, because they'll say that they were out on their quad riding, and out of nowhere this kind of creature appeared, and as it was walking away it simply vanished. I hear that a lot, and this is something that they claim that had happened. One of the most astounding claims I've ever heard was people riding their quad, and they were coming around a corner, and there was a Bigfoot standing there. And as they kind of fishtailed to a halt, the creature let out these huge wings, and then it took off. So you have these kind of chimera type of creatures out there that a lot of investigators kind of, toss to the side. One of the most spectacular eyewitness encounters that I've ever taken note of was by an older woman who had a very, very detailed description of this creature that she said was a Bigfoot. But the interesting part of this experience, none of it happened in the woods. It happened within her apartment. This creature manifested itself one day in her living room. She was immediately upset, and telepathically, she claims, this creature said that he was only there to observe her. And it got to the point wherever it was watching her do mundane things from time to time, like vacuuming, or she said it watched her do laundry so much, she started to call it her laundry monkey. But it was there. It would appear within her house. It would never touch her or do any kind of harm or anything like that. And she didn't have any feelings of fear or dread. It was just something that happened until one day the creature did not manifest anymore and it was gone. So what are we supposed to do with something like that, right? She saw it as, whenever it materialized as a flesh and blood creature, but yet it was able to communicate with her through her mind. And, that's a very difficult thing to explain. This apartment was not near the woods. It was a creature that, we would believe to belong out in the forested area that was manifesting itself in the house. So, yeah, again, this would think, well, is it a brownie? Is it something that is localized to that particular area? And these are the kind of things whenever I'd like to connect the dots and think, well, if this happened, 1,000 years ago in England, this would have been definitely an encounter with a brownie, some sort of spirit that is fixated on a localized location, right? So I think that what is going on is that people are experiencing things that they themselves know is not flesh and blood if they continue to examine what they had seen more and more. Sometimes they're just seeing a brief encounter of something, a fleeting kind of glimpse of something in the woods. But whenever you get these detailed sightings about they see something walking, and then gradually it disappears. Now, I have a story for you that happened to me. As I've said, I've never seen a physical manifestation of a Bigfoot, but I've heard sounds and I've seen footprints, and I've seen enough anecdotal things to keep me going. But one of the strangest things that happened to me was a few years ago, whenever there was a snowstorm the night before, and I got up in the morning and my kids didn't have school the next day, so it was going to be a pretty stressful day for me. So I opened up the door to see how badly it snowed, and it was that fresh fallen snow, which is so beautiful to look at. And the 6 o'clock hours, it was glistening. This was a perfect hallmark moment right here. But I noticed across my lawn was a set of tracks, and it didn't look like rabbit tracks, and it didn't look like typical animal tracks. So I decided to put on my shoes and go investigate a little bit. So outside my door, I find these tracks that were barefooted. You could clearly see all 5 toes, but they were about the size of a dollar bill. So these were not huge tracks. And I thought, well, this is kind of strange because I'm a Bigfoot investigator, and now it looks like there's Bigfoot tracks right in front of my house. So I try to find the origins of this because my house was surrounded by woods. And guess what? These tracks did not come from the woods. Actually, they appeared quite strikingly in the middle of my yard, and not all at once. So what had happened was the tracks appear out of nowhere, and it's a right track, another right track, and then a left track and a right track, and then the trackway continues. And it comes up to my downstairs dining room window and goes up to it as if it was peering in, and then it goes down over the hill and it disappears completely. The trackway vanishes. So it appears to me, at least, that whatever was causing these tracks slowly manifested into a physicality within our world, within my world at least. So the tracks seem to, as if it stepped off of something or stepped into our reality from, another dimension or whatever, for lack of a better word, and it manifested itself. And for whatever reason, it came to my house, nobody else's, and then it went over the hill. So what that says to me is that what I'm searching for out there as a Bigfoot investigator also understood that I was a Bigfoot investigator, as if there was some sort of knowledge about who I was as well, because the probability of something like this happening to somebody is outlandishly, exponentially impossible. But it came to me for whatever reason, and then it vanished. So that was a very, very strange thing. And also as an investigator, I've been to places that were supposedly haunted, supposedly the domain of Bigfoot, supposedly the area where Dogman was sighted, and almost all the time, and I'm talking about like 80% of the time, which is quite high for an investigator to experience something like this. I've experienced, and other investigators with me have experienced, and even photographed the phenomenon of earth lights, these strange types of illuminations within the woods, and most of the time they appear, and they may move around the trees, but occasionally they seem to want to investigate the investigators. And I've had a couple of very bold statements by these earthlights that have actually came up to us, and seem to at least analyze us is probably the wrong word to use, but they seem to at least assess why we were there. And that is really kind of, as an investigator, it was really kind of overpowering to see these kind of things, because so many people had written about earth lights and spook lights and ghost lights, and the idea of St. Elmo's fire whenever you're at sea. It was kind of like these were the dots that we needed to connect, that what was going on is related to these things that are appearing out in the woods as well too. So as an investigator who was lucky enough to have a couple of very almost impossible sounding things happen to me, that keeps me going. And now the dots I'm trying to connect, as I've said, are these illuminated spheres of light that appear to be under some sort of intelligent influence.
I talked to someone about that very thing. Of course, a lot of the people I interview also see orbs, especially when they're in the wooded area. They may also have seldom visual sightings, but it's the sounds, the calls, the sounds, things like that. But I did talk to someone that did believe that the orbs were the Bigfoot, and that they could go back and forth between a light energy and then transforming into an actual physical energy. And is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what I'm saying. Yes, that these are the vehicles by which these creatures are able to enter into our world. So people talk about portals, and people talk about interdimensionality, and the idea of light. That even our reality, the light that we see from the sun and everything that we see is all made up of individual particles, right? So the idea that there's that these things can become part of an element, and physically produce itself out of that element, does to me make sense. But this is, when we're talking about ghosts, even, there's this energy of the deceased that still remains, and this is how they exist within this world. And I think there is something to be said about that. And so if we think that ghosts are capable of doing this, then why not other types of energies, right? And that's the point that I'm getting at. So I think that we are dealing, at the end of the day, with the idea of energies, and how we are supposed to view these energies, and how these energies interact with us. And it's very possible the energy that is being released from these orbs is able to affect our minds in some way, that we perceive them to be something that they are not.
Someone once mentioned also that, like, the orbs are the vehicle for the Bigfoot and some of these other elements possibly, and maybe craft that we see is a vehicle for what we perceive as aliens, and might be even one and the same. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I feel exactly the same about that. Here in Westmoreland County, where I live, and along the Chestnut Ridge, Westmoreland and Fayette County. Fayette County is really one of these places that have a lot of high strangeness and a lot of woo factors. This is the area where people have been seeing for the past 50 years, UFOs and Bigfoot. So people have reported seeing Bigfoot walking a fence line, and in the background a UFO lands. Or people have experienced Bigfoot holding a glowing sphere in their hand, as if they were holding, one of those orbs in their hand, and then UFOs appearing overhead as well. Now, I will tell you this, and this is an interesting connection as well, where all this high strangeness happens. Like I said, it's called Fayette County, and that is French for little fairy. And as I started investigating the use of the word Fayette around the world, around the country at least, that I find that there's a lot of high strangeness there. If you look at Fayette County in West Virginia, that's where the New River Gorge is, and that's where a lot of Bigfoot activity takes place as well too. So is it possible that whenever these places were called Fayette, that the people that put that name on it weren't giving it some sort of flowery little name, but almost like a warning, like here be dragons? So because a lot of these places are very, very old. So I'm thinking that whenever you see these kind of place names, the people that found that area knew that these things were happening there, and they put it on the name because this was a place of high strangeness even then.
Have you correlated anything about, because there are, just kind of like Skinwalker Ranch, there are those locations that seem to have everything happening. We have Marley Woods here in Missouri. There's, Skinwalker Ranch. There are other places around the country, and it sounds like Pennsylvania may have those too, where it all happens there all at the same time.
That's
Have
right.
you correlated any reason why a location would be instrumental to that?
Well, I've got to experience and investigate the Bridgewater Triangle as well too, the Dogman Triangle in eastern Pennsylvania, and then of course the Bermuda Triangle that we have. Now, one of the connecting dots there with all these places is the idea of these unusual earth lights that exist there. But I think what I feel like is that here in America we don't talk a lot about ley lines and the idea of an earth grid. But I firmly believe, and as I study more, that the world is a powerful conductor of energy. And there are certain places within this world where this energy kind of comes to the surface, and it's much more powerful in these areas. The ancients know this because they built temples there. And I think that, even in the Middle Ages, we see, the Catholic Church ripping down these pagan temples and putting up Catholic churches on the site where these temples stood, because there's something to be said about this site. There's some sort of energy there. But if we look at places like, where the Great Pyramids are, or where Stonehenge is, or even like where Loch Ness is right now, all these places are great historical sites, right? People are flocking there to see some of the great wonders that are there. But also these places are all synonymous with other paranormal activity as well too. There is some sort of specialness to these places. They're set aside for different reasons. The Bridgewater Triangle, whenever you look at the Wampanoag people, the Aboriginal people that lived up there, the idea of the Hockomock Swamp, which is kind of like the heart of the Bridgewater Triangle, that name means the place where spirits dwell. So again, going back to the very beginning of our conversation, this idea that when we talk about the supernatural, it's some sort of conduit between two worlds. And it always gets back to the essence that there is a spiritual element to it. So maybe the physical element isn't even important to a lot of these Aboriginal folks, but the idea of the spirituality, the idea of that energy being able to straddle two worlds at once is what made it very special to them.
In your investigations, you've been out there, you said you'd heard sounds and such, and those are fairly common. Have you heard the Sierra sounds? Because those are just phenomenal. What is your opinion of those if you have listened to them?
Well, you know what, I have, and I've done a few tours the conferences with Ron Moorhead, and I've got to talk to him at length about this as well too. And of course he was a flesh and blood guy as well at the very beginning, but now he is starting to come across the idea that Bigfoot also is this interdimensional type of creature. And he came out with a great book called The Quantum Bigfoot, which is a must read for any investigator. Not and it doesn't matter which side of the fence you fall on, whether flesh and blood or some sort of interdimensional creature. It's just a must read. He also relates that as he researches Bigfoot more and more, he's seeing this connection with strange lights in the woods as well too. And one particular encounter that he's mentioned was this bar of light that slowly moved through the woods. And during one of my experiences as well too, even before I read the book or spoke to him about this, I also experienced something that looked like a flaming bar of light that was moving through the woods as well too. But the Sierra Sounds is incredibly frightening to me because it seems as if there's some sort of um, embryonic speech going on there, some sort of cadence, as if we were listening to something trying to communicate, maybe not with us, but communicate with something of their own kind. And it's at first very human sounding, and at the same time quite alien sounding as well too. And I don't mean extraterrestrial; I mean just simply foreign to what our ear is picking up. But yeah, it's one of those things where I recommend that if you haven't heard the Sierra Sounds, to definitely listen to them. But I recommend you don't do it at night by yourself.
I did an extensive interview with Scott Nelson, who has analyzed those quite in depth. And there is obviously a lot of humanness, or at least language elements there, that states rather clearly that there's some kind of a communication there. I don't know that they ever saw what was creating that. They did see a Bigfoot up there in the Sierras. They heard a lot of things. A lot of things happened up there, but I don't know that they actually ever saw them speak that. So there's a lot of speculation there, but as to presumption that it's a Bigfoot or not a Bigfoot, but obviously there was some kind of a sound happening there. Do you know of any place else in the world where that profound of a recording has happened with the sounds? Because most of all, it's just howls and hoots and wood knocks.
Absolutely. And no, I cannot think of another place. We have like the Ohio howl that they call it, and that is just one of these, blood curdling type of howls going on. But the idea where it sounds like there's communication going on, absolutely not. Now, it's interesting that you brought that up, Linda, though, because, I spoke to Mr. Moorhead regarding his capturing the Sierra Sounds, and he did not see anything making those sounds. He assumed that it was Bigfoot because he saw two, what he called Bigfoot, in that particular area. But nobody ever recorded what was going on. So we really don't, at the end of the day, know what's going on. Now, your opinion upon, Todd Standing is out there. He has done a lot of controversial things, and he has a few recordings out there of something that sounds a little bit like the Sierra Sounds, but not that definitively amazing. But I cannot think, and that's a great question, but I cannot think of any other place in the world where the sounds have been recorded that is that significant to researchers.
Exactly. So it makes me wonder if the location, like we were talking about ley lines, and that something is able to enter in certain places, that place has some kind of specialness to it, rather than for it to be just a Bigfoot, and those are the communication skill of anyone, anywhere. Or even if, and this is really far-fetched, but even if that is a language out of context of our time, even.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. There's nothing far-fetched about that as well, too, because we're all trying to make sense of these experiences that are going on. And that is a great sort of theory, because we don't know what these sounds mean or anything like that. And again, we are looking at these areas from our point of view, right? And what's interesting is, so I looked at the idea of ley lines, I've looked at the idea of energy portals, and a lot of places that are considered sacred to the Native Americans are also places of high strangeness as well. But what is so curious, in a lot of these places, we have representations of things like the medicine wheel, or we have representations on petroglyphs of these swirling type of symbols. So I started to look, started to try to connect the dots. So I tried to find how far back these symbols go. And I found out, like in Mesopotamia, in Babylon, and Sumeria, we see these images of this swirling figure. Looks almost like, a whirlpool type of thing written on stone. And I thought, well, this is very curious, because sometimes these figures were associated with somebody appearing to either enter in them or manifest that out of them. So, what is called now is the Anunnaki. But I will tell you that as as someone that's trained in history, it would be career suicide for me to say that we are talking about the Anunnaki. But I will tell you that the figures that are represented are called the Anunnaki in textbooks because they represent, a certain types of deities within that particular world of the Fertile Crescent. But we see these swirling patterns where the deities that are known as the Anunnaki appear to be entering into or exiting out of these swirls. And I thought, well, this is very strange. Let's see if we can connect the dots. And Newgrange, the tumulus in Ireland, which dates to right around the same time as the Great Pyramids, gosh darn it, they have these same type of swirls going on as well too. And I found evidence of these swirls and petroglyphs in Africa, in China, in Arizona with the Native Americans. Is it possible? Okay, again, is it possible? We talk about these swirling patterns. We talk about this entry into another world. Okay, so let's look and see where else we find these circular patterns. One of the places we find them is in Stonehenge. Again, this idea of circular type of energy. So is it possible that Stonehenge and other places where these monolithic structures are put up, could that have been the ancients' way of saying this is a place of power and use it for healing, use it for communication, what have you? But it was indeed set aside from the rest of the world through arduous circumstances to put up these kind of stones. And, it's just not in Stonehenge. We also have them up in the Orkney Islands. We have them in France, and we have them scattered throughout Europe. So it is my opinion that whenever we see these stones, that these are a demarcation that we're dealing with something other than just regular ornamentation. A lot of work went into these kind of places. And I think whenever we have places like the Egyptian civilization that were able to do much more monumental things, we have places set aside like the Great Pyramids, right? And then also we talk about crop circles, these kind of circular patterns as well too. And another place where we find circular patterns is the idea of the fairy ring, sometimes represented as mushrooms. And what would happen if you stepped inside the fairy ring, you would then enter the world of the Fae. These were believed to be gateways to another world. And what I am starting to believe that the places where we see these areas of high energy, these gateways, if you will, are sometimes set aside by ancient cultures who were intrinsically tied to the land, and they knew that this was a place of high energy levels. And like I said, oftentimes pagan monuments were built in these areas. And I do believe firmly that the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages recognized these areas to be high energy portals and actually built churches upon these things as well too. And I think that we in a modern society have kind of stepped out of this natural frequency of the world, and we are now in our own little frequency, right? Because we don't need the natural world anymore. We go to the store to buy our groceries. We have electric lights. Our circadian rhythm is off. We are not really part of the natural world anymore. But that frequency still exists out there. We just aren't taking any notice of it. And because we don't take any notice of it, does not mean that it's still not very powerful and very prevalent nowadays too.
What are those footprints out there? What are those, sounds that people see? What are those wood structures that people are? I mean, there's a lot of physical evidence. So if these creatures make their way into this physical realm and become physical enough to impact our physical world that we perceive as a real, genuinely solid piece of work here, how do they do that?
So I think you've hit the nail on the proverbial head here, Linda. So, and I will tell you, as we're getting ready to wrap everything up, this has been one of my favorite interviews. Very rarely do we find people within this field that are as knowledgeable as you are. So I really appreciate, as a guest, coming onto a program like this whenever you don't have to kind of explain yourself to the person. So I will tell you that I'm very, very flattered that you had me on. So I appreciate that. But so what I tell people is whenever they say they've had a real, very real experience, and I will tell them, yes, you did have an actual flesh and blood experience, because it is my opinion that even though we're dealing with the idea of energy and spirituality and all this other kind of stuff, I do believe that whenever this transition is made into our world, these are physical creatures, right? These are physical creatures that are able to leave behind hair, that they're, they can go to the bathroom, they can do whatever what physical creatures do here. And we don't know how long they maintain a physicality within our world, right? It could be a duration of time. So I think that when we talk about wood structures, which I have seen, tall trees, some 40-foot trees bent over and placed behind other trees that is still growing. It's still a living tree. So it wasn't done by any kind of wind or anything like that. It was intentionally put here by something for some purpose, out in the middle of the woods. It would take an incredible amount of strength, but it apparently was some sort of, a designation for that particular area by whatever kind of animal made that. The idea of sounds, whenever things produce sounds, that's a very physical thing to do because it's a communicative a way by which we talk to one another. So there is always going to be a physical dimension, even though we say there's interdimensionality at play here. People can be touched by these things. People can, smell them. People can interact with them because they are physical within our realm. So it's not all woo all the time, right? There is something to be seen. So the people that are out there, the so-called boots on the ground investigators, they are actually doing a very big service to the field of the paranormal, because these things are obviously leaving behind footprints and they are making a direct impact on our world around us. And, these are also clues that we need to get to that, that kernel of truth that's going on there. So to anybody that thinks that we are somehow undermining their encounters or somehow glossing over their experiences, that is indeed not the case. You've had an experience unlike the vast multitude of humanity. And I am also of the mind that whenever people are experiencing these things, it is almost as if you are gifted that for some reason, that there is almost a connection between the experiencer and that which is being experienced. And this circuit has to be connected in order for it to happen. I don't know how you feel about that, Linda, as well, too, but that's also in my line of kind of like frequency, that this frequency is always out there. And if you accept that there's that frequency out there, it's kind of like turning on a light switch, because that connection is now made, and now you can deal with the things that are in the world around you. But I do believe that is also the case, that if you're experiencing something, if you're hearing something, the reason why you're hearing something or seeing something is because that was meant to happen to you.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to often what I talk to people about. You can't take the experiencer out of the experience.
No, absolutely
very
not.
much an intertwined experience, whether that be spiritual or physical. And another thing is, it doesn't have to be black and white. That can be both physical and non-physical.
Sure, absolutely. It's almost like the realm of the shaman. It was a physical human being that was able to transcend the world around him and enter into another world. That's the way we could look at it as well too. It's also, if it was under different circumstances, we could put it down to like a religious experience. It's something that's very subjective, it's very personal, and it's also very profound in its manifestation to that particular person as well too. So again, we're not taking anything away from the person that's experiencing this. We're just trying to find out some sort of I guess some sort of explanation for what the heck is going on.
I think that's it, and I think that's what we don't fully have at this point. I think perhaps past cultures have been more comfortable with that two worlds phenomena, but we sort of have a real black and white physical world that we live in today for the most part in our society. So we don't allow for those other worlds to coexist, I should say, in our world very comfortably.
Oh, perfectly stated. So that's why I wrote a book on fairies a couple of years ago, and that is my conclusion as well too. So whenever we decided that we were going to leave the world behind and start putting up walls, so imagine, imagine us now, at one time we were out there hunter and gatherers. We were dependent upon the cycles of the season. We were just another animal out there. And then all of a sudden we decided that we were going to get together, and we get together, we start building homes, and then we start putting up walls. And then what happens? Then it becomes us, the civilized, and them, which is the chaos in the natural world. Once we've set ourselves apart from the natural world, there's really no going back, because now it's us and them. And the things that are now going, bump in the night, and these nightmares that we have projected onto these natural things in the world, that is our doing, right? That is our saying that these things are monsters. They're not giving us reasons to say that they're monsters. That is our perception of them. And a lot of it has to do with fear, because again, we are so accustomed to being together as a human race, and taking advantage of the natural world, and instead of being in union with it. And once we've broken that union, then of course we are now projecting ourselves onto the world, and everything that goes bump in the night is something terrifying and monstrous rather than natural. Think about this for a second. So think about this: if you were, a Native American or a First Nations person, or whatever kind of Aboriginal society that you lived in, these creatures, getting back to what we talked about at the very beginning, the one professor wrote that we might have been in contact with these creatures, into historical times. If we live within their world, they become a part of our world. They're not something extra out there. They're not a nightmare. They're part of our world. And then we simply need to negotiate that world with these creatures in them. Once we left that world, we no longer negotiate with them anymore, and they become, our enemy, so to speak. And that's really where our fear comes from. We are afraid of the other, and we shouldn't be afraid of the other, because one time we were there as well.
Yeah, and it does appear that, since a lot of people have these when they are in a very natural setting and often alone,
That's right.
they become in harmony. There again, you talk about frequency. They become in harmony with their environment, and then they are capable of hearing, seeing, or having some kind of an experience with whatever these creatures are.
That's right. Yes, you're definitely speaking my language, my dear. That's absolutely the case. The idea of allowing yourself to be present in the natural world, and the harmonies simply sync up, right? That harmony is always there. Mankind was made for that harmony. It resonates with us as well too. And we have decided to step out of that harmony. That frequency is still there. It did not abandon us. We abandoned it. And it seems kind of strange that we get into the natural world, and all of a sudden we sync up with that we start hearing things, we start seeing things that people deem to be supernatural or paranormal, where, in my opinion, it's just part of the natural world that we no longer recognize.